Asterisk 36 times. That's how many times Bumpy Johnson's blade found its target in a single Harlem restaurant fight. By cut number 12, Ulysses Rollins was already finished. By cut 24, he was permanently blinded. By cut 36, 200 witnesses were too terrified to breathe. And Bumpy did something nobody expected. He stood up, adjusted his tie, stepped over the body like it was a puddle, and told the waiter he wanted spaghetti. This wasn't just a fight. It was a message, and everyone in Harlem understood it. Summer of 1935, Harlem, New York. If you walked down Lenox Avenue that year, you could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. The streets belonged to two forces about to collide. On one side was Dutch Schultz, the German Jewish mobster who controlled half of New York's Underworld. He wanted Harlem's numbers racket, all of it, and he didn't care how many black bodies he had to step over to take it. On the other side was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a 30-year-old enforcer who had already earned a reputation as Harlem's most dangerous man. Bumpy worked for Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the brilliant numbers queen who had built an empire from nothing. He had made her a promise. Harlem stays black, no matter what. Dutch Schultz had already sent dozens of men into Harlem, and Bumpy, along with his crew of 9, had been picking them off one by one. His wife would later write that it was easy, since there were few white men walking around Harlem during the day. Schultz was getting desperate. He needed someone who could handle Bumpy Johnson, someone who wasn't afraid, someone who could match violence with violence. That's when he called Chicago. Ulysses Rollins was 6'2", 200, 40 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. He had killed 11 men before his 25th birthday. In Chicago, they called him the Bull, because once he charged, you couldn't stop him. Schultz paid him $5,000 up front and promised $10,000 more if he could. Eliminate Bumpy Johnson. Make it loud, Schultz told him. Make it public. I want every numbers runner in Harlem to know what happens when they resist. Rollins arrived in Harlem on Tuesday. By Thursday, word had spread. Dutch Schultz's new enforcer was in town, and he was looking for Bumpy. What Rollins didn't understand about Harlem was that the streets had eyes. Shoe-shine boys, newspaper vendors, women selling flowers on corners, they all worked for Bumpy. By Friday morning, Bumpy knew Rollins was in town. He knew what hotel he was staying at, what he ate for breakfast, that he carried a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster and a knife in his boot. And Bumpy knew something else. Rollins was watching him too. That Friday night, Bumpy had a date. Not with a Harlem girl, but with Helen Lawson, a senior editor and film critic at Vanity Fair. Helen was white, sophisticated, educated at Vassar College. She wrote Broadway reviews and interviewed movie stars. She was also fascinated by Bumpy Johnson. They had met 3 weeks earlier at a jazz club while she was researching an article on the Harlem Renaissance. Bumpy was intrigued by a white woman who wasn't afraid to sit in a black club, who asked intelligent questions, who saw Harlem as more than crime and poverty. Dinner at the Alhambra, Bumpy suggested. Best jazz in Harlem, and the food isn't bad either. Helen said yes. The Alhambra Bar and Theater on the corner of 126th Street and 7th Avenue was Harlem royalty. Duke Ellington had played there. Billie Holiday had sung there. On Friday nights, the place was packed with 200 people musicians, hustlers, intellectuals, everyone who mattered in Harlem. Bumpy arrived at 8 o'clock, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his fedora set at a precise angle. He looked like a banker, not a killer. Helen was already seated, wearing a blue dress and pearls. They ordered drinks, and the conversation flowed easily. She asked about his childhood in Charleston. He asked about working at a magazine where she was one of only 3 women. A jazz quartet played softly in the background. The atmosphere was perfect. At 8:47 p.m., the door opened. Ulysses Rollins walked in. Bumpy saw him immediately. The way Rollins moved shoulders back, eyes scanning the room like a predator, told him everything. This wasn't a man coming for dinner. This was a man hunting. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Rollins smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who had found his target. Helen noticed Bumpy's posture change. The relaxed gentleman vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. "Bumpy?" she asked. "Is something wrong?" "No," Bumpy said quietly, never taking his eyes off Rollins. "Everything's fine. Excuse me for just a moment." Rollins moved through the tables slowly, deliberately. He wanted this scene. This was the public execution Schultz had paid for. When he reached Bumpy's table, he stopped. Rollins stood. Bumpy remained seated. The power dynamic seemed clear, at least to Rollins. "You Bumpy Johnson?" Rollins asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Depends who's asking. Dutch Schultz sends his regards. Says you've been a problem. Says problems need to be solved." The jazz kept playing, but conversations around them faded. People felt what was coming. "Tell Dutch," Bumpy said calmly, "that Harlem already solved its problem with him. He just doesn't know it yet." Rollins laughed. Big words. For a man sitting down. That's when Bumpy saw it. Rollins' hand drifting toward his jacket, toward the pistol in his shoulder holster. Bumpy made his decision. If that gun came out, innocent people would die. Helen, the musicians, the waiters. Bullets don't care who they hit in a crowded room, so Bumpy moved first. It happened so fast that most people didn't see the beginning, only the end. Bumpy's hand shot out, not toward Rollins, but toward the table. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the steak knife beside his dinner plate. The knife was 6 inches long, serrated, sharp enough to cut through bone. Rollins saw the movement and reached for his gun, but Bumpy was already moving. He exploded up from his chair with a speed that didn't seem human. The chair crashed backward as Helen gasped. Bumpy drove the knife forward. The first cut slashed Rollins across the forearm as he drew his pistol, sending the gun clattering to the floor. The second cut opened Rollins's cheek. By the third cut, Rollins understood he wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting something else, something that moved like water and struck like lightning. They slammed into a nearby table. Glass shattered, food flew, and people screamed as they scattered. Bumpy didn't stop. Cut 4. Cut 5. Cut 6. Rollins tried to fight back. He was bigger and stronger, but Bumpy was faster. Every time Rollins swung, Bumpy slipped the blow, and the knife found flesh. Cut 12 tore across Rollins's ribs. Cut 18 split his shoulder. By cut 24, Rollins was on his knees. That was when Bumpy went for the eyes. In the chaos, Helen had moved away from the table, pressed against the wall with other terrified patrons. But she couldn't look away. She watched as Bumpy Johnson, the man who had been discussing Langston Hughes' poetry just minutes earlier methodically, dismantled a man twice his size. The knife moved as an extension of Bumpy's hand, every motion precise and calculated. This wasn't rage. This was mathematics. Cut 25 struck above Rollins's left eye. The blade went deep. When Bumpy pulled it back, Rollins's eyeball came with it, the damage permanent and irreversible. Rollins screamed, a sound Helen would hear in her nightmares for years. The entire restaurant fell silent. Even the jazz quartet stopped playing. 200 people stood frozen, witnessing something out of a horror story. Bumpy stood up. Rollins lay on the floor, bleeding, his face a mask of blood. He was conscious, but broken, whimpering. And Bumpy, covered in blood that wasn't his own, did something nobody expected. He reached down and straightened his tie. The calm, deliberate gesture sent a chill through everyone in the room. He stepped over Rollins's body, not around it, but over it like stepping over a puddle. Bumpy returned to his table, picked up his fallen chair, set it upright, and sat down. Helen stood frozen against the wall, staring at him. Bumpy looked up and smiled, the same charming smile he'd given her when she arrived. "I apologize for the interruption," he said calmly, as if nothing had happened. He searched for the waiter, who was pressed against the bar, pale with shock. "Excuse me," Bumpy called out. "Could we get some menus? I seem to have worked up an appetite." No one moved. Bumpy picked up a menu from a nearby table, studied it briefly, then looked at Helen. "You know what?" he said. "I suddenly have a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." The waiter, hands shaking, took the order. No one else in the restaurant moved. They only watched. Helen slowly made her way back to the table, her legs weak. She sat across from Bumpy as he calmly wiped the blood from his hands with a napkin. "You should go," Bumpy said quietly. "This isn't a place you need to be." Helen couldn't move. She was in shock, watching a man who had just committed extreme violence sit as though he were waiting for his morning coffee. 8 minutes. Later, the spaghetti arrived. Steam rose from the plate, the red sauce looking almost black in the dim light. Through the window, Helen saw an ambulance pull up as medics rushed inside to collect Ulysses Rollins. Still breathing but barely conscious, Bumpy Johnson picked up his fork, whirled the pasta slowly and deliberately, and took a bite. Helen watched, unable to look away, as he ate. Not quickly, like someone trying to prove a point, but slowly and casually, like he was truly enjoying it. "It's good," Bumpy said, glancing up at her. "You should eat something." Helen looked at her own plate, knocked aside during the fight. She couldn't imagine eating. Her stomach was twisted in knots. But Bumpy took 3 more bites, each one deliberate, each one a statement. By the time the medics loaded Rollins onto the stretcher, Bumpy had finished half the plate. The police arrived as Bumpy was setting down his fork. By then, the ambulance had already taken Ulysses Rollins to Harlem Hospital. He would survive, but he would never see out of his left eye again. The cops knew better than to arrest Bumpy Johnson. Half of them were on his payroll. The other half understood that in Harlem, Bumpy was the law. Self-defense, one officer wrote in his report. Victim drew weapon first. Multiple witnesses confirm. By Saturday morning, the story spread through Harlem like wildfire. It wasn't just the violence. Harlem had seen violence before. It was how Bumpy ended it, the spaghetti. That detail became legendary. Men told their sons. Women told their daughters. That's how Bumpy Johnson handled his business, cool as ice, even with blood on his hands. The story reached Dutch Schultz by noon. Schultz was in his office at the Harmony Social Club in the Bronx when his lieutenant walked in, white-faced. "Boss Rollins is in the hospital." Bumpy Johnson cut him to pieces in a restaurant, took his eye out. Schultz set down his cigar. "Is Rollins dead?" "No." Then he failed. Schultz stood and walked to the window. "You know what the problem is?" he said. "We keep thinking we can intimidate these Harlem boys. We keep thinking if we send someone bigger, meaner, stronger, they'll back down." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed mob history. "We leave Harlem alone." His lieutenant stared. "What?" "You heard me. Bumpy Johnson just sent a message. Harlem is not for sale. We've lost 40 men trying to take that neighborhood. 40. And Johnson isn't even breathing hard." Schultz turned back to him. "Call Lucky Luciano. Tell him we need a sit-down. Tell him we need to make a deal with Bumpy Johnson." 6 months later, Dutch Schultz would be dead, killed on orders from Lucky Luciano, and Bumpy would negotiate the deal that made him the godfather of Harlem, the first black man to sit at the table as an equal with the Italian mafia. But that Friday night in 1935 at the Alhambra restaurant, Bumpy was just a man having dinner, a man who ordered spaghetti while another man's blood was still wet on the floor. After the police left, Helen asked Bumpy to take her home. She couldn't stay in that restaurant another moment. The smell of spaghetti sauce mixed with blood made her feel sick. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Bumpy said as they stepped into the Harlem night. Helen was quiet for a moment, then said, "That man came to kill you." "Yes." "And you knew he was going to?" "Yes." "So the whole dinner was a trap?" Bumpy stopped walking and looked at her, something like sadness in his eyes. "I didn't set a trap. I just lived my life. But when a man comes to kill you in front of innocent people, you handle it fast and you handle it final, so everyone knows what happens next time." Years later, Helen wrote about that night in a memoir that was never published. She described Bumpy as the most contradictory man she had ever met, a killer who quoted poetry, a gangster who tipped his hat to old women, a violent man who carried the weight of his violence like a cross. The story of the 36 cuts became legend in Harlem. But what most people missed was this: Bumpy didn't just destroy Ulysses Rollins that night. He destroyed the idea that Harlem could be conquered by outsiders. Every mobster in New York heard this story. Every politician, every cop. They all understood the same message. Harlem protects its own. Bumpy Johnson would rule Harlem for the next 30 years. He would go to prison twice, serve time in Alcatraz, negotiate with the Italian mafia, protect Malcolm X, and become a legend. But on that summer night in 1935 at the Alhambra restaurant, with 200 witnesses watching him step over a bleeding man and order spaghetti, Bumpy Johnson taught Harlem and the world a lesson about power. Real power isn't just violence. Any thug can kill. Real power is control. It's precision. It's the ability to destroy a man and calmly straighten your tie. It's sending a message so clear, so final, that you never have to send it again. Ulysses. Rollins never returned to Harlem. Weeks later, he tried once more to kill Bumpy at Frank's restaurant on 125th Street. He missed Bumpy and killed an innocent woman instead. That was Rollins's last act as a free man. He disappeared after that. Some say Bumpy's men found him. Others say he fled back to Chicago. No one knows for sure. What everyone knows is this: after that night at the Alhambra, people spoke Bumpy Johnson's name with respect or not at all. Years later, an old man who had been there that night was asked what he remembered most. He thought for a long time, then said, "The spaghetti." "I remember thinking, this man just took another man's eye out, and he's sitting there eating. Pasta like it's Sunday dinner. Not pretending. Actually eating." That was when he knew. That was when they all knew. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous. He was something else, something colder, something unforgettable. That's how legends are made. Not in the big moments, but in the small ones. In the way a man adjusts his tie. In the way he steps over a body. In the way he orders spaghetti. 36 cuts. One message. One legend. That was the night Harlem learned who Bumpy Johnson really was.